The cottonwood trees along the creek had gone bare weeks ahead of schedule. Their gray branches scratched at a pale, washed-out sky, the color of old bone. The wind moving through them, carrying the particular coldness of something that had traveled a very long distance to arrive here at the edge of the Dakota Territory in the last week of September 1887. A traveler passing on the county road that cuts south through Coldwater Flats would have seen nothing worth stopping for. A cabin with a roof that sagged in the middle, a stone chimney leaning slightly east, a single window that caught no light because no light was angled that way in the afternoon, leaving it dark as a closed eye. The leaning shed behind it, the broken fence line stretching west until it gave up entirely, the last post lying flat in the grass, like something that had simply lost the argument. The general impression of a place that had already surrendered to whatever forces the plains chose to bring against it. But the traveler would have been wrong. There was a thin thread of smoke from the chimney, nearly invisible, torn apart by the wind before it could take any shape. There was a figure working at the side of the cabin where a thick cord of split wood was being stacked against the north wall, with the deliberate care of someone who understood exactly what the wall was for. Not shelter from the cold in the vague, hopeful sense. A specific, calculated barrier against a specific, calculated threat. The figure swung an axe, split a log, cleanly stacked both halves without pause, then set the next round on the block with the same unhurried motion. No wasted movement, no looking at the sky. This was Willa Crane, 23 years old. The last thing anyone in Coldwater Flats expected to still be standing on this land when the first hard frost arrived. She had come 6 weeks prior with two possessions that mattered. One was a folded document, a deed signed at the county seat in her own hand, conveying to her sole ownership of the 160 acres once belonging to a man named Doyle. The other was a trunk, iron-bound, dull with age, weighing enough that two men at the rail stop in Millhaven had been required to carry it to her wagon, both of them grunting with the effort, both of them watching her with the particular curiosity people reserve for things they cannot immediately categorize. She thanked them without explaining. The trunk rode in the wagon bed all the way to Coldwater Flats, shifting with the road's ruts, but never tipping its weight, making the wagon sit low in the rear. When she arrived at the cabin that was now hers, she carried it inside herself 1 inch at a time, her boots dragging furrows in the dirt floor, setting it against the south wall beneath the window. She had not opened it yet. That was 6 weeks ago. The trunk sat exactly where she had placed it, and every morning she rose and did the work of the day, the clearing of debris from the yard, the pulling of rotted fence posts, the assessment of every crack in every log wall, every evening returning to a cabin where the trunk stood against the wall like a decision she was still building up to. She had learned early, watching her father move through the world, that the timing of a thing mattered as much as the thing itself. The trunk would be open when the moment called for it, not before. The land itself offered no welcome. The 160 acres comprising the Doyle parcel sat on the western edge of what passed for farming country in this part of the territory, which was to say it sat on the fringe of what most men would consider viable. The soil was not bad exactly. It was marginal, the word the banker had used in a tone suggesting that marginal was a charitable assessment. 3 successive tenants had worked it. All 3 had left. The last of them, Doyle, had sold in the spring, the sale apparently a matter of considerable relief to everyone involved, except perhaps Doyle himself. The cabin he left behind was drafty, the root cellar barely scratched into the earth, the fence posts rotted at their bases so that a firm shove dropped them. He had abandoned a summer's worth of equipment in the leaning shed, rusted implements, whose original purposes were sometimes unclear, as if even the tools had stopped making sense by the end. Willa had looked at all of this on the day she arrived and made a list in her head. Not of grievances, of tasks. That was the thing about her that the people of Coldwater Flats could not quite parse. They had expected grief or desperation, or at least the visible signs of a young woman confronting the scope of what she had taken on. What they saw instead was a person working through a list. The town of Coldwater Flats was not large. A main street with a general store that also served as the post office, a bank occupying a narrow building beside it, a Lutheran church at the far end, a livery, a boarding house, a handful of residences that ranged from adequate to aspirational. The whole thing existed because Edmund Greer had decided it should exist, which was not the official history, but was the accurate one. Greer had arrived in 1871 with capital, established the bank, extended credit to the first wave of homesteaders, then built the general store when he understood that a man who controlled both the money and the provisions controlled everything between them. By 1887, there was almost no transaction in the lives of the people within 50 miles of Coldwater Flats that did not somewhere in its chain pass through Edmund Greer. He was 53 years old with a broad, well-fed face that had settled into an expression of permanent benign authority. He wore good wool. He kept his boots clean. He smiled often, the smiles reaching his eyes in the way that smiles do when a man has not been wrong about very many things for a very long time. He had a wife who ran the store with the same smooth efficiency she brought to their household two grown sons in the territorial government, a membership in every civic organization that mattered. He was the kind of man whose power was so thoroughly woven into the fabric of daily life that most residents had stopped being able to see it as power at all. It was simply the way things were organized. He came to see Willa Crane on the 1st of October, 3 days after her arrival. He came on his black gelding, which was the finest horse in the county, ridden with the ease of a man who understood that the height of a horse is a form of argument. He did not dismount. He looked down at the cleared yard, at the pile of debris she had already removed from the fence line, at the fresh chinkings she had worked into the lower logs of the cabin's north wall, and something moved briefly across his face. Not quite surprise, but a minor recalibration of expectations. He had arrived with fully formed. "Miss Crane," the name settled over her like a claim. "I trust you've had time to get a sense of the property." She had been pulling a rotted fence post when he arrived, her heavy wool skirt tucked into her work apron to keep it clear of the mud, her sleeves rolled against the exertion. She straightened, set the post aside, wiped her hands. She said nothing. He described the terms of her mortgage, the balloon payment due on the 1st of May, a sum she could not earn through 6 months of Dakota winter on marginal land with no livestock beyond a milk cow and a small flock of chickens. He described it as a formality, a mechanism by which the bank secured its interest. He described his offer to purchase the property back from her, a number roughly 1/3 of what she had paid, as a reasonable arrangement, an opportunity to avoid unnecessary hardship. His voice carried the smooth, unbothered quality of a man performing a transaction he had performed many times before, each time with the same outcome. Most find it prudent to settle before the snows rather than suffer through a season only to reach the same conclusion in the spring. He was telling her that her life here was already over, that the conclusion had been written before her arrival, that the only question remaining was whether she would accept this with grace or with the kind of stubborn pride that the prairie was very good at correcting. Willa listened. Her hands were still. Her eyes held a point slightly above the gelding's left ear. When he finished, she said nothing. He took her silence for the dumb comprehension of a woman processing difficult information, or possibly for agreement. He told her the papers would be ready at the store when she came for her winter provisions. He tipped his hat, a small, courteous gesture that contained within it the absolute certainty of outcome, then rode south along the county road, dust lifting behind him in the still afternoon air. She stood watching the road for a long time after he disappeared. Then she went inside, not to pack, not to sit at the table with her head in her hands. She went to the trunk. She did not open it yet. She stood in front of it with one hand resting on the iron latch, looking at it, thinking about Doyle. From the inner pocket of her coat, she took a bundle of letters. They were tied with a piece of string worn soft at the creases from having been folded and unfolded many times over many months. The return address on the topmost envelope read, Doyle R.T., Coldwater Flats, D.T. The letters were addressed to her father. Henry Crane had received the first of them in the winter of 1885, when he was still well enough to sit at the kitchen table in Cleveland and read by lamplight. He had kept them in the bottom of his trunk, beneath his tools and his journals, and when he understood that the pneumonia was going to finish what it had started, he told Willa where the trunk was and what it contained. She had read Doyle's letters after the funeral, sitting at that same kitchen table in Cleveland, in the dark of February, the smell of coal smoke in the wool of her coat. Doyle wrote the way a man writes when he has been waiting a long time to tell the truth to someone who might understand it. He described 3 harvests, each one slightly worse than the last, the way the margins thinned until there was nothing left to thin. He described the loan terms that had seemed reasonable in the summer of good faith, becoming instruments in the autumn of bad weather. He described the October morning when Edmund Greer had declined regretfully to extend credit through the winter, the specific timing of the refusal, which came precisely when Doyle's options for finding credit elsewhere had already closed, and the conversation that followed in which the offer to purchase the land was made. At a price, Doyle wrote, that a man accepts not because it is fair, but because there is no longer a choice to make. There was one more letter the last Doyle had written shorter than the others. It contained no self-pity. It contained only a single observation. The thing Greer did was not unusual or illegal. It simply required that a man be watching for it, and that watching required knowing where to look. Doyle had not known where to look until it was too late. He was writing, he said, so that someone else might know sooner. Willa had read those letters twice through sitting very still. Then she had begun making arrangements. She had not come to Coldwater Flats because the land was good. She had not come because she had nowhere else to go, though it was true she had nowhere else to go. She had come because she understood from Doyle's letters the specific shape of what Edmund Greer did and how he did it. She had come because this was the fight her father had been too sick to pick, and because someone ought to pick it, and because she was the only person left who knew enough to try. She put the letters back in her pocket. She looked at the trunk. Then she put her hand on the latch and opened it. What she found inside was not dramatic. No gold, no weapon, no document that would solve anything by itself. A small cast-iron pot nested inside a coil of rope. A block of beeswax wrapped in cloth. A dairy thermometer, its glass tube protected by a leather sleeve. A length of twine already tied to the hook at its base. A hand-cranked grain mill made of cast iron. Its handle folded flat for travel. Its grinding plates worn smooth in the way that tools get worn when they have been used seriously for a long time. A small balance scale, its brass pans nested together, the calibration weights wrapped separately in flannel. These items her father had chosen deliberately one by one in the last months when he was still well enough to think clearly about what she would need. Beneath them was a journal. The cover was brown leather soft with age. The pages inside filled with her father's handwriting, small, dense, orderly. The handwriting of a man who kept manifests, who understood that the difference between a careful record and no record was sometimes the difference between a ship arriving and a ship not arriving. She picked it up. It fell open to the first page because that was the page he had intended her to find first. She read, "A properly sealed hold keeps grain 18 months on the lake. Runs Detroit to Buffalo and back if the moisture is managed. The principle holds on land. Find your frost line. Below it, the earth remembers summer." She stood in her drafty cabin with the Dakota wind pressing at the chinking she had not yet finished, and she read that line twice. Then she closed the journal and held it against her chest for a moment, not thinking anything in particular, just feeling the weight of it. The weight of a mind that had been preparing for this moment without knowing it was this moment it was preparing for. Then she set it on the table and went back outside because there was still wood to split before dark. The town of Coldwater Flats arrived at its consensus about Willa Crane with the quiet efficiency that small communities achieve when everyone already understands what the consensus will be before anyone states it aloud. The general understanding formed in exchanges at the counter of Greer's store and in the vestibule of the Lutheran church was that she was a tragic figure of the particular kind the frontier produced in some quantity, young, stubborn, operating on some misapprehension about what a woman alone could accomplish on marginal land in a territory where proven men with proper equipment had already failed. The refusal of Greer's offer was seen not as strength, but as the specific kind of pride that precedes the kind of fall that the prairie was very efficient at delivering. The response was not hostility. Coldwater Flats was not a hostile place. It was a practical one, and practicality in this instance expressed itself as a kind of careful distance. When Willa came into the store for salt and lamp oil, conversations that had been ongoing simply paused until she had completed her transaction and left. Margaret Greer, who managed the store while her husband managed the bank, measured out the goods with an efficiency that was not unkind but was not warm either. Cash only for this account, those were the instructions her husband had left, and she did not need to say it more than once. The ledger in which every other homesteader's purchases were recorded against a running balance remained closed during Willa's visits. The pencil stayed in its cup. Credit was the oxygen of every homestead in Coldwater Flats between October and May. The understanding that you could carry a balance through the winter months and settle it after the spring thaw was so fundamental to survival that most residents did not think of it as a benefit so much as a feature of the landscape like the creek or the road. To be excluded from that understanding was to be placed outside the community's collective survival structure. Willa Crane was being placed outside it, and the people of Coldwater Flats did not have to be told that this was happening. They understood it from the way Margaret Greer's hands moved. The neighbors who had been cautiously friendly in the first days of her arrival now found other things to look at when she passed on the road. They were not cruel people. They were people with their own mortgages, their own balloon payments, their own accounts at the store. The calculus of social alignment in a place where one man controlled the provisions, the credit and the banking was not complicated. To stand visibly beside someone Edmund Greer had decided to dispossess was to place your own standing in jeopardy, and standing in Coldwater Flats was not an abstraction. It was the difference between getting through the winter and not. Carl Bauer was the only one who still acknowledged her directly. A nod brief given with the particular dignity of a man who has decided something and is not interested in revisiting it. She noted it, stored it away. Carl Bauer had been in Dakota 8 years, had the build and bearing of someone who had done hard things and expected to keep doing hard things without making speeches about it. His wife Martha had once brought over a jar of preserves in the first week after Willa's arrival, before the consensus had fully formed. The jar of preserves was still on the shelf. Willa had not opened it. She looked at it sometimes in the evenings, this small act of human decency that had arrived before decency became costly. The old trapper Jed Holcomb occupied a position slightly outside the town's social structure, in the way that very old men sometimes do when they have been in a place longer than most of the current residents and have therefore not built their loyalties in the same patterns. He was somewhere north of 70, with a face so deeply lined it looked like a topographical survey of somewhere remote, and he had worked his trap lines along the creek since before the territory had a proper name. He did not shop at Greer's store more than absolutely necessary because he preferred to owe as little to anyone as possible, a philosophy that had served him for 50 years of uninterrupted survival. He sat on the bench outside the store on the afternoon Willa came in for salt, and when she emerged, he was looking at the sky in the way he often looked at it, not at any one thing in it, but at all of it at once, weighing it like a man checking a scale. His voice carried the flat authority of a man reporting a weather event that had already been decided. Going to be a season, special kind, hadn't seen a sky that color since the winter of '48. She stopped, looked at the sky, high, pale, utterly clear, with a quality of light that did not seem to come from any single direction. A beat of silence, then her question came out quieter than intended. How bad was '48? Jed Holcomb moved the tobacco in his cheek. Wolves came into Millhaven in daylight, stood in the street, didn't run when people came out to look. A pause that carried the weight of the specific memory. Animals know things before people bother to know them. She walked home thinking about that. Back at the cabin, she sat at the table with the practical working notebook she had brought from Cleveland, where she had begun the process of calculation that would either save her or demonstrate conclusively that it could not be done. One column assets, the other requirements. Assets: 1 milk cow, 11 chickens currently producing, but due to slow in the cold, a root cellar with potatoes and winter squash, sufficient for approximately 2 months at normal consumption. $40 in cash. Her axe, her father's tools, her own health, her own labor. Requirements: 6 months of winter minimum. Caloric needs for one person and one cow calculated against what she had. Heat requirements based on the cabin's dimensions and insulation. She had done rough calculations, arrived at a number that was frightening. The balloon payment in May, a fixed figure that bore no relationship to anything about her circumstances except the bank's determination to collect it. She did not look at the gap between the two columns for long. It was a fact. She recorded it. Her father had taught her to record facts even when they were bad, especially when they were bad, because a fact you looked at directly was a fact you could work with. She closed the notebook. She picked up Henry's journal. She read for 2 hours by the light of a single lamp turned as low as it would go and still produce a useful flame. He had written about ships, manifest cargo loads, the mathematics of provisioning a crew of 22 men for a 3-week haul across the lake. He had written about his particular enemy, which he called moisture, consistently throughout the journal, the way a soldier refers to a specific opponent rather than a general concept. The water and the air work together. They are partners in destruction. 10% moisture in a barrel of wheat combined with 50 degrees, and time does not degrade the wheat. It transforms it into something else entirely. You are not storing food at that point. You are cultivating a catastrophe in the dark. He had written about temperature, specifically about the differential between the surface world and the world below what he called the frost line. He had written about this threshold with the reverence another man might reserve for a law of nature, which was what it was. 4 feet down in Ohio clay, the Earth maintains approximately 40 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of surface conditions. It is not affected by summer heat or winter cold in any meaningful way. It is the most reliable temperature in the world because no one controls it and nothing disturbs it. A properly constructed storage space below the frost line is not a cellar. It is a covenant with the Earth. She put the journal down. She understood what needed to be done. The next morning, she began trading labor for grain. This was the part of her plan that the people of Coldwater Flats found genuinely puzzling. When Willa Crane arrived at the Halverson farm offering a full day's wood splitting in exchange for a bushel of wheat, Halverson had agreed, because he needed wood split, but he watched her load the wheat into her wagon with the expression of a man who cannot make the arithmetic work. She had no mill visible anywhere on her property. Raw grain without a way to process it was not a meal. What was she going to do with raw wheat? She spent 2 days repairing the fence on the north boundary of the Pratt farm. Thomas and Margaret Pratt had been cautiously open to the arrangement, perhaps because they were newer to the territory, had not yet fully absorbed the community's consensus about her prospects in exchange for a sack of oats. She spent a day cleaning the Jensen barn in exchange for dried corn, 3 days helping get in the last of the sod on the Barrow homestead in exchange for barley, a day and a half hauling water for the widow Marsh who had hurt her shoulder in the spring in exchange for a portion of buckwheat Marsh had stored and could no longer lift. Each transaction was clear, the terms agreed upon before the work began, the exchange completed without renegotiation. She did not ask for charity. She asked for work, and she did the work with the full measure of what her body could produce. People observed. People wondered. A young woman trading genuine hard labor for raw grain she apparently had no way to use. The mystery of it was mild, the kind that gets discussed at supper and then set aside because there were other things to worry about with the season closing in. What they could not see was the machine she had unpacked from the trunk, her father's hand-cranked grain mill set on the cabin table, its cast-iron body cold in the morning light. She tested it with a handful of the first wheat she brought home. The grinding plates were set close, the result a rough flour, coarse as cornmeal, but flour nonetheless. She held a pinch between her fingers, felt the grit of it, thought of her father at the Cleveland table, grinding small test amounts of various grains, the way another man might whittle, not because he needed to, but because he liked to understand the mechanism of things from the inside. She swept the test flour into a small cloth and stored it. Nothing wasted. The labor continued, 6, sometimes 7 days a week from first light until the last of the afternoon was gone. She came home each evening with her body carrying the deep, resonant fatigue of muscles used to their limit, not the sharp pain of injury, but the particular ache of sustained, purposeful effort. She ate sparingly. She split her remaining firewood into smaller pieces to make the pile last longer. She calculated. The column of assets in her notebook grew slowly, one exchange at a time, each day's work converting her labor into the stored energy of grain that would outlast the winter in a way that potatoes and squash and salted pork could not. The work on the cabin itself ran in parallel, the task that had to precede everything else, because the cabin was the vessel, and a vessel with holes in it could not hold anything worth keeping. She mixed clay from the creek bank with dried grass, working it together with her hands until it reached the consistency of bread dough, pressing it into every crack and seam in the log walls. The north wall was the worst. The logs had shrunk with age, pulling apart at the joints, leaving gaps through which the wind moved freely. She worked from the ground up, pressing and smoothing, her fingers going raw in the cold creek water and then cracking in the dry air. She worked at it a section at a time, returning to check each completed section a day later, pressing in any places that had cracked while drying. Then the sod. She cut it from the prairie in the thick rectangular bricks, each one lifting, with a sound like something being torn away from something else, the root systems releasing reluctantly. She stacked them against the north and west walls 3 feet high, creating an earthen embankment that would intercept the wind before it reached the logs. Each brick weighed 40 to 50 pounds. She moved them one at a time, carrying them from the field, setting them, moving back for the next. It took longer than she had calculated. Most things did. By the 4th day of the sod work, she had developed a rhythm carry set return that her body could sustain without the kind of conscious effort that wore a person down faster than the labor itself. She thought of it as a conversation with the ground. The ground was saying, "This is what I weigh." She was saying, "I know." On the fourth day of digging, the digging, which would come after her hands cracked through to the skin at two knuckles on her right hand, she wrapped them with cloth torn from an old shirt, soaked the cloth in tallow to keep the skin from splitting further, and continued. There was no dramatic moment of decision here, no summoning of resolve through gritted teeth. She simply continued because the work was not yet finished, and an unwrapped knuckle would become infected. And an infection in November in this place with no doctor within 40 miles was a category of problem she was not prepared to manage. In the evenings when the light was gone, she read more of the journal. Henry Crane had been a methodical writer who did not editorialize much. He recorded facts, procedures, principles. But occasionally a sentence appeared that was something other than procedural, that carried a quality she could only describe as her father's voice speaking directly through the ink, bypassing the years and the miles and the distance that death creates. One night she found this: "A man who understands the frost line understands that the earth is on his side if he asks correctly." The mistake most men make is asking the wrong questions. They ask how to fight the cold. The correct question is where the cold does not reach. She read it several times. Then she set the journal face down on the table and looked at the floorboards. The cabin had no proper cellar. She had known this when she arrived, seen it in Doyle's description, confirmed it on her first day. There was a shallow crawl space beneath the floor, barely 2 feet of depth, full of old debris and the packed earth that had simply never been excavated. 2 feet was not enough. 2 feet sat well above the frost line, even in a moderate winter, and what Jed Holcomb was predicting was not a moderate winter. She needed 5 feet. That was the number from her father's journal, 1 foot below the deepest recorded frost line for this part of the territory. 5 feet down, the earth would hold its covenant. She began to dig. She pried up the floorboards in the center of the room. The wood had warped enough that a flat bar lifted most of them without much resistance and stacked them against the wall. The earth beneath was dark, packed hard by years of use, smelling of old dust, and something that might once have been grain, a ghost of previous provisions. She began with a small spade, working the loose topsoil into a bucket, carrying the bucket outside, dumping it, returning. The first foot came out relatively easily. The second was harder, the soil more compacted, requiring a pick to break it loose before the spade could work. The third foot was dense clay, blue-gray in color, requiring serious effort with every stroke. She worked the digging in the early mornings before the light was good enough for outdoor work, and in the late evenings after the outdoor labor was done. The hole expanded slowly. She kept its dimensions precise, 10 feet by 4 feet, a rectangle she had measured twice and marked with stakes before lifting the first board. She worked by lantern light in the evenings, the small flame throwing her shadow large against the cabin wall, the scrape of the spade steady in the cold quiet. Outside, the wind moved across the prairie without interruption, for miles in any direction, indifferent to everything below it. She tracked her progress in the notebook, recording depths at each corner, checking that the floor of the excavation stayed level. The hauling of stones from the creek was a separate project run in parallel. She needed flat river stones to line the bottom and walls of the pit, a clean, stable surface that would also help regulate moisture exchange. The creek was a quarter-mile from the cabin. She built a simple sling from rope and a piece of canvas, loaded it with as many stones as she could reasonably carry, walked to the cabin, deposited them beside the growing hole, walked back. She made this trip 7 times in one day and lost count of how many times in the days following. The stones she chose with some care, flat, dense, without obvious fractures, that would admit moisture, sized so that they could be laid in courses against the pit walls without requiring mortar to stay in place. It was on one of these return walks coming back from the creek with a load of stones in the second week of October that she saw Carl Bauer on the road. He was driving his wagon north, a load of fence posts in the back. He passed within 30 feet of her. He looked at the rope sling full of creek stones. He looked at her. He gave the same brief, dignified nod he always gave, but she thought she detected something additional in it. This time, not pity, not quite understanding, but the particular recognition one person offers another when they identify a shared quality. The recognition that this person is serious about what they are doing. She nodded back. He drove on without stopping. When the pit reached its depth, she checked it with a length of knotted rope calibrated against her own height, 5 feet 2 inches at the deepest point. She walked its perimeter. The clay walls were firm. The smell from below was different from the smell of the topsoil cooler, more mineral clean in a way that disturbed soil rarely is. She pressed her palm flat against the wall at the lowest point and held it there. Cool, stable, unchanged by the world above. She began laying stones. The barrels came from the Harwick farm 3 miles east. She had traded 5 days of harvest help for 6 large pickle barrels, solid oak tight stave carrying the lingering sourness of 2 seasons of preserved cucumbers. She loaded them into her wagon one morning and drove home, the barrels rolling and knocking together in the bed. Sterilizing them was 3 days' work. She built a contained fire of dry hardwood coals inside each barrel, letting the interior char, then doused and scrubbed with a mixture of sand and water until the sourness was gone from the wood entirely. The result was a clean, neutral surface, odorless, the grain of the oak, open and dry. The sealant was the most critical step, the one her father had returned to in the journal with particular emphasis. He had written wax and fat together form a compound that neither air nor water can penetrate if applied in sufficient layers. 3 coats minimum. 4 is better. The temptation to economize is understandable and must be resisted. The enemy enters through the smallest possible gap. The gap you leave is the one it will find. She rendered the remaining salted pork she had been rationing through October a small but necessary sacrifice against a specific future, collecting a half bucket of pure white lard. She melted the beeswax from the trunk in the cast iron pot, combined it with the lard over the stove, stirred until the mixture was uniform, then painted it hot onto every seam, every gap, every inch of each barrel lid's contact surface. She let each coat cool completely before applying the next. It took most of 2 days. The smell in the cabin during this process was warm and animal, the smell of something being preserved against time. The grain went in last. She weighed each measure, wheat, oats, corn, barley, in the small balance scale from the trunk, her father's precision instrument from his years calculating cargo weights on the lake runs. Total 212 pounds. Not enough to be comfortable. Enough to be strategic if she was careful, if the system worked as the journal said it would. She left 2 inches of space at the top of each barrel, replaced the lids, sealed every perimeter with a final coat of the wax compound, let the whole thing cure through the night. The barrels were heavy. Each one full of grain weighed 60 to 70 pounds, movable by a strong person, but not the kind of weight that could be reliably lowered 5 feet into a stone-lined pit by one woman alone without risking everything she had worked 3 weeks to prepare. She walked to Jed Holcomb's place at dawn, a mile and a half across the cooling prairie. He was outside when she arrived, working on one of his traps with a small wrench. He looked up without expression. Her voice was direct, no preamble. "I need help lowering something heavy. Half a day's work. I can pay in grain." He set the trap down, looked at her with his sun-damaged eyes. "What's the grade of the hole?" 5 feet, stone-lined. He picked the trap back up, finished what he was doing with the wrench, set it in the pile with the others. "All right," he said in the tone of a man who has already calculated the situation and arrived at his conclusion before being asked. He arrived at the cabin 2 hours later, assessed the rope and fence post she had set up as a rudimentary lever, said nothing about her engineering. He went and got the cow from the shed without being asked, understanding immediately that the animal could serve as a counterweight anchor. He rigged the rope through a configuration around the fence post that gave them something approaching a mechanical advantage, tied a wide sling beneath the first barrel. Then they worked together without much conversation, her holding the rope as he positioned the barrel, the cow providing passive resistance at the end of the line, the whole system moving each barrel down in a controlled descent rather than a catastrophic one. 6 barrels, 4 hours. When the last one was nestled against the stone floor of the pit, she covered them with a layer of clean, dry straw she had brought from the shed. Then she began filling the earth back in bucket by bucket, layer by layer, packing each addition with the flat of the spade until the surface was solid. Jed Holcomb watched her work for a few minutes. Then he walked outside. She heard his horse leaving. When she looked up later, he was gone, but there was a small, neat pile of dried meat on the table that had not been there before. He had left it while she was bent over the pit, said nothing about it, asked for nothing more. She covered it with a cloth to keep the dust off. The floorboards went back in their places one by one, fitted back into the gaps they had warped into over years of freeze and thaw. She left one board, the third from the west wall, unfastened, just resting in place, able to be lifted without a tool. Only she knew which one. When she finished, she stood in the center of the cabin and looked at the room. It looked exactly as it had when she arrived. Rough walls, low ceiling, a shelf with a few tins on it, the trunk against the south wall, the stove in the corner with a modest stack of wood beside it. The floor looked like a floor. The room looked like a room that might belong to someone who was barely holding on. Outside the window, the first real snow of the season had begun. Not a storm, just the season stating its intentions in a quiet, declarative way. Small flakes drifting through still air, settling without urgency on the broken fence line, on the roof of the shed, on the enormous face of the prairie. Willa stood at the window for a moment and watched it come down. Then she looked back at the floor. Her father had been a man of precise language who did not believe in rhetoric. He had believed in measurements and manifests, in the specific and verifiable fact. He had told her once, sitting at the table in Cleveland, with the smell of his illness already in the air, though neither of them had named it yet, sharpening a tool by lamplight in the way he always did when he needed his hands busy. The thing about the earth is that it doesn't promise you anything. It doesn't need to. It just does what it does down to the inch, and the only question is whether you've paid attention. She had paid attention. The barrels were sealed, buried, covered in the stable dark below the frost line, and the winter could begin. Her breath fogged in the cold air of the cabin. She moved her lips, not quite a prayer, not quite an address to her father who was 8 months gone and not coming back. Something between those things. A quiet statement of fact issued to the floor, to the earth below it, to the principle that the earth remembered summer, even when the world above had forgotten it entirely. Now we find out if you were right. The snow kept falling. The lamp burned low. Outside, the prairie held its breath. The cold that arrived in the second week of November was not the kind that announced itself. There was no wind, no drama, no sky darkening with visible intent. It came as a pressure, a high dome settling from the north, clearing the clouds away until the sky was a brilliant, unforgiving blue that offered nothing, not warmth, not shelter, not even the comfort of a storm's visual company. A clear sky in November on the Dakota Plains meant the earth had no blanket. It meant the heat was simply leaving quietly in every direction at once. The mercury at Greer's store dropped through the first marked day of real cold without pausing at any intermediate reading long enough to offer hope of a plateau. -10, -15. The creek, which had been running sluggishly for 2 weeks, went silent on the third morning, not gradually but all at once, the way a voice stops mid-sentence. The ice that formed across it was not the thin exploratory kind that appears at the edges first. It was solid, gray-blue opaque with cold all the way through. Inside the cabin, Willa felt the shift, the way you feel a change in a room's air pressure, a quality of stillness that was different from ordinary quiet, as though the world outside had decided to pay close attention. The chinking she had pressed into the log joints through October held reasonably well against a still cold. The sod embankment on the north wall was doing its work, but the interior temperature measured against the body's own reliable instrument was hovering just above the point where water stops moving and becomes something else entirely. She had the cow inside with her. The animal's body heat was a genuine and measurable contribution to the cabin's thermal economy, something she had calculated before making the decision, not sentiment. The cow shifted in the corner that had been cleared for her, breathing slow, patient clouds of steam that rose to the low ceiling. The two of them shared the space with the pragmatic arrangement of creatures that have agreed without discussion that survival takes priority over comfort. The stove she managed with a discipline that bordered on ceremony. She had calibrated her wood supply against the length of the winter that Jed Holcomb's sky had promised an estimate she treated as a minimum rather than a maximum, then calculated a daily burn rate that would maintain a bed of coals through the coldest hours without consuming more than the reserve could afford. The result was a cabin that was survivable without being comfortable. The single window was coated in frost so thick it had become opaque. The view outside, replaced by a surface that caught the morning light, diffused it into a pale, uniform glow. She slept in every piece of clothing she owned under all the blankets she had. With the quilt her mother had made in Pittsburgh years ago, survived the transit from Cleveland at the bottom of the trunk on top of everything else. She ate small portions of potatoes from the root cellar, supplemented with the dried meat Jed had left rationed to a specific weight per day, recorded in the working notebook beside the caloric requirement column. The numbers aligned, but barely. What she had not fully accounted for was the psychological weight of the cold, when it became sustained rather than occasional. The frost on the window, the way every breath she drew had a faint mineral quality, as though the air itself were becoming less willing to be breathed. The sounds the cabin made in the deep cold, the timbers contracting a low creaking that was not alarming but was constant, a reminder that the structure around her was engaged in its own struggle against the temperature. Doubt was not something she had given much space to during the weeks of preparation. The labor had occupied her body so completely that the mind had been left with little energy for anything other than the next task. Now, with the preparation finished, the physical work reduced to the measured routines of maintenance, the mind had room it hadn't had before. It used the room for questions she had not permitted herself to ask in October. The journal described conditions in Ohio. Her father had sailed on the Great Lakes, studied the behavior of storage holds in Ohio winters, taken his temperature readings from Ohio Earth. The frost line in Ohio was not necessarily the same as the frost line in Dakota. She had assumed they were comparable, built her entire plan on that assumption. The assumption could be wrong. Her father, meticulous as he was, had never been to the Dakota Territory. He had given her a principle. She had applied it to a specific location he had never visited. The principle and the location were either compatible or they were not, and she had no way to know which until the answer declared itself. The cold outside dropped to -18 on the night she lay awake working through this. She knew it not from looking, but from the quality of the air against the cabin wall, the specific sound of the stove settling, the way the cow moved a slight increase in restlessness, the animal's own thermostat registering a change. -18 was a number that belonged to a different category from the milder cold of the previous weeks. It was cold that did not negotiate. She got up. The floorboards were cold through her wool socks, the chill driving upward through the sole of her foot, with a clarity that was almost aggressive. She moved to the third board from the west wall, the one she had left unfastened, lifted it with 2 fingers. It came up without resistance, releasing a breath of air that rose against her face. She felt it before she measured it. Not the cabins hovering near freeze, not the brutal -18 pressing from outside. Cool, the specific, reliable coolness of a temperature that was not reacting to anything happening above it, that had simply been what it was and would continue being what it was, regardless of the season. She took the thermometer from its leather sleeve. The twine was already attached. She lowered it through the gap in the floor, letting it run until she felt the small resistance of it settling against the straw that covered the barrels. Then she waited, counting in the silent cabin with the wind absent, the cow still nothing in the room, moving except the faint dance of the lantern flame. 100. She drew the twine up, slowly brought the thermometer into the lantern light, held it there with a hand that was not, she noticed, with some distant part of herself, quite steady. 41 degrees Fahrenheit. She looked at the number for a long moment. Outside, the world registered -18. Inside the cabin, the air pressed down at 33. Below the floor, below the frost line and the stone line dark, where the barrels sat sealed against moisture, the earth was holding 41 degrees Fahrenheit, as calmly as it held anything, as if cold were a concept it had heard about once and found entirely unpersuasive. She sat down on the floor with the thermometer in her hand, the lantern beside her light, moving slowly on the rough boards. The grain was not just safe. It was sitting in conditions that would preserve it indefinitely, better than any pantry shelf, better than any above-ground cellar, in a chamber that the coldest winter in 40 years was currently failing to affect by a single degree. Her father had been right, not in the way a person is right when they make a good guess, in the way a person is right when they understand the underlying physics of a situation so completely that rightness was never actually in question. Only her faith in his understanding had ever wavered, not the understanding itself. She sat on the floor for a long time. The lantern burned down a little. When Willa finally moved, something large had passed through her and left behind a different quality of stillness than she had carried before. She thought of her father not with the particular grief of recent loss, the sharp, specific absence of a person who should be in a room, but with a clarity she had not been able to access since the funeral. She understood now that his obsession with manifest, with cargo holds and moisture content and temperature differentials had not been the eccentric preoccupation of a man who found human warmth more difficult than logistics. It had been a form of provision. He had spent decades learning the exact things she would need to know, then spent the last months of his life putting them in a form she could carry. The trunk, the journal, the tools. He had not been able to stay. He had done the next best thing. She pressed her palm flat on the floorboard beside the open gap, held it there for a moment, the way you hold a hand in a final goodbye, except this was closer to the opposite of goodbye. Then she replaced the board, returned the thermometer to its sleeve, crossed to the cot. She lay on her back in the dark, looking at a ceiling she could not see, letting the certainty settle through her, the way warmth settles slowly from the inside out. Survival was no longer a question, only its difficulty remained. Reverend Samuel Hatch arrived in early December on a sleigh pulled by a broad-chested draft horse that blew enormous clouds of steam with every step. He was a genuinely kind man, not performatively compassionate, but actually quietly concerned with the welfare of the people in his parish. Willa Crane had occupied a troubled corner of his thinking since October. He had heard the consensus. He had unspoken reservations about it, but he also knew the winter, and he had seen what the winter did to young people alone on the prairie who had overestimated their own resources. He came expecting to find her reduced, pale thin, the particular haunted quality that cold and hunger produce when they work on a person together. He brought a small loaf of bread from his wife, still faintly warm from the oven wrapped in cloth. He brought a month-old newspaper from Millhaven, because isolation was its own kind of damage. What he found was a cabin that was cold, yes, unmistakably, uncomfortably cold, but immaculate. The floor swept, the tools in their places, the cow with a coat that showed consistent feeding. Willa herself was thinner than she had been in September, the hollows of her face more pronounced, but her eyes were clear, her movements deliberate. There was almost nothing visible on the shelves. A few tins, a bin with some potatoes. Nothing that should be keeping a person alive through a month of serious cold. Hatch sat at the table with his hat in his hands, the bread sitting between them, unable to locate the narrative he had brought with him. The story of the young woman in over her head did not fit the evidence in front of him. His voice carried the careful tone of a man revising his sentences as he spoke. The Lord provides for those who endure, Miss Crane. It is remarkable that you are... He let the sentence end somewhere vague. Something close to warmth moved across her expression. I am managing well, Reverend. Thank you for the bread. He drove back to Coldwater Flats with the unease of a man whose category system has encountered something that doesn't fit any available slot. When he described what he had seen to the people who asked, he said, she was alive, appeared well. He could not account for it. The shelf had been nearly bare. She had shown no signs of malnutrition. The story moved through town with the particular speed of an anomaly in a place where everything else is predictable. It reached Edmund Greer before evening. Greer heard the report the way he heard most information, as data to be sorted against what he already knew. The data point of a woman with no visible food supply remaining functional after 6 weeks of serious cold did not add up under either of the two hypotheses he had been operating under. Either she was worse off than she appeared, which the minister's account made difficult to maintain, or she had resources that were not visible. He considered a third possibility only briefly before setting it aside, that she had managed the situation through a competence he had not accounted for. He set it aside because accounting for that possibility would require revising assumptions he had not needed to revise in 20 years of managing Coldwater Flats. He came himself a week before Christmas on the black gelding that was beginning to show the effects of the cold in its movement, a slight stiffness in the hindquarters that would have concerned a less preoccupied rider. He came under the guise of a courtesy call, which no one, including himself, was deceived by. Inside the cabin, his eyes moved with the efficiency of a man conducting an inventory. Shelves nearly bare. Root cellar hatch, the lock on it showed marks of regular use. Woodpile adequate but not generous. No sacks of flour. No hanging meat. Nothing that accounted for the situation. His gaze settled on the trunk against the south wall. She had not sold it, which meant either it had sentimental value or it contained something she was not willing to part with. He crossed to it without asking, lifted the lid. Willa did not move from where she stood. She watched him. The handmill, the pot, the remaining beeswax reduced from the original block to perhaps a third, a length of rope, then the journal. He picked it up the way a man picks up something he does not expect to matter, lifted the cover. He read for perhaps 3 minutes. His face during those 3 minutes did not change in any way that could be easily described. It was the expression of a man encountering a text in a language he does not speak, recognizing that there are words on the page without being able to access what the words mean together. He put the journal back. He closed the lid. The line is blocked at Fargo. His voice was flat. Nothing is moving through before spring. Not supplies, not anything. He was watching her face as he said it, looking for the flicker of alarm that would confirm what he needed to confirm the reaction that meant she had been counting on a resupply that was no longer coming. He saw nothing that resembled alarm. No supplies for anyone, he continued with the patient specificity of a man inserting a blade between ribs he has already located. Whatever is in Coldwater Flats is what there is until the thaw. Every household is working from what they put by in October. What they have is what they have. He picked up his coat. He moved to the door, paused there, back partially to her, looking at the wall rather than her face when he delivered the final line, which was perhaps the one mercy in the entire exchange. "Let the winter have you, Miss Crane." The door closed. She stood in the quiet of the room listening to the sound of the gelding moving away down the county road. Outside, the pale December light was already failing. She stood still for longer than was usual for her because she was not a person who stood still when there was work to do, which meant this stillness was the product of something specific. She was thinking about those 3 minutes he had held the journal. He had not understood what he was reading. She was certain of that. A man who understood what was written in those pages would not have left with the confidence he had just displayed. He had seen words about grain storage on a ship. He had not seen a solution to his problem. He had not understood that he had a problem yet. Lucy Haddon's farm sat 1.5 miles northeast, a small operation that had been her husband's before the fever took him in 1886. Lucy was around 30 with the economical manner of someone who has decided not to waste energy on things that couldn't be helped. She had not been among those who avoided Willow on the road, not warmly forward, but not avoidant either. A neutrality that felt in the context of Coldwater Flats that autumn like its own form of decency. Willa visited on a clear afternoon in mid-December, carrying a portion of dried meat from Jed's supply, alongside the specific knowledge that Lucy had a root cellar full of turnips that were going to become inedible by February if they weren't managed correctly. The two women sat at Lucy's kitchen table, warmer than Willa's cabin, the fire burning with less restraint, while Willa explained what she knew about storing root vegetables in slightly damp sand, how the moisture prevented the shriveling that made stored turnips inedible by midwinter, how the sand provided a stable microclimate that extended the useful life of the vegetables significantly past what an open shelf could achieve. She drew a rough diagram on a piece of paper. She explained the reasoning behind each step, not just the steps themselves, because a person who understood the reasoning could adapt to circumstances a person following instructions alone could not. Lucy listened with full attention, the kind that doesn't interrupt because it's too busy absorbing. When Willa finished, Lucy's voice carried the matter-of-fact tone of someone updating their operational plan. "I have enough sand in the barn floor to do 6 bins. I can start tomorrow." Then the conversation moved to other things. To Cleveland, where Willa had come from. To a town in western Pennsylvania where Lucy had grown up. To the particular quality of grief that comes from losing a parent to slow illness, which both of them had experienced, and which was different from sudden losses, leaving a different kind of mark, not a wound, but more like a long scar that had closed properly, but never fully smoothed. They talked about snow, about this winter's specific stillness, which felt unlike previous ones, about the animals that had moved through the territory or stopped moving through it in ways that Jed Holcomb took seriously. Lucy mentioned she had not seen any rabbits near her fence line in 2 weeks. The rabbits always disappeared first. She said something her father had told her, though she hadn't thought about it in years. Willa walked home in the last of the afternoon light with her breath making shapes in the cold air, carrying something she had not felt since arriving at Coldwater Flats, the slight warmth of having been genuinely in someone else's company. The visit to Jed Holcomb she made 2 days later, taking a portion of cooked grain she had prepared from the buried stores the first time she had cooked from the barrels rather than the surface provisions. She made more than she needed, poured a large portion into a covered pot, carried it the 1.5 miles to his place. He was at his outdoor table skinning a rabbit with the rapid practiced movements of a man who has performed a task so many thousands of times that it no longer requires any conscious direction. He looked at the pot at the pot again. He accepted it without comment, which from Jed was close to an expression of gratitude. She asked him about the winter of '48. Not casually, she genuinely wanted the detail of it, wanted to map what he remembered against what was coming. He was quiet for a moment. She had learned to recognize as him, deciding how much to say. "Started the way this one started. High pressure, no wind, just cold coming down like a weight. The creek stopped in November. The wolves came into the towns by December, not just around the edges into them. Stand in the street in broad day. A pause waited with the specific memory. The cold does something to things, makes them forget where the line is. She thought about that for the walk home. The cold makes things forget where the line is. She thought about the frost line 4 feet below the surface, where the earth held its steady 41 degrees, regardless of what happened above. The cold didn't reach the frost line. The frost line was where you went to remember what temperature actually was uncorrupted by the season. She thought about Greer reading the journal and seeing nothing useful. He didn't know where the line was either, he just hadn't needed to know it yet. That night she opened her father's journal to a blank page near the back. She wrote with deliberate care, her handwriting different from his, larger, more angular, but sharing the same economy of language, the instinct toward the specific and verifiable that he had modeled over years without making it a formal lesson. December 1887. Coldwater Flats, DT. Recording from November, observations frost line verified at 4 feet 2 inches. Temperature below on coldest night 41 degrees Fahrenheit. Temperature at surface -18. Barrels intact, grain dry seal holding. HC was right. She looked at the last sentence for a while. Then she added one more line, smaller than the others in the margin, where he used to put his secondary observations. The earth remembers what the sky forgets. She put the journal down. The lantern had burned to its lowest useful level. The cabin held its cold quiet. She lay down on the cot and looked at the ceiling she could not see in the darkness, listening to the silence of a prairie winter night, with the wind absent, which was its own kind of loud. The first days of January arrived with a cold that had deepened past the point of temperature and become something more like a fundamental condition. The thermometer outside Greer's store marked -25 on the morning of the 8th. On the 10th, it reached 30 below. The number stopped mattering at a certain level because what it communicated was not degrees of cold, so much as a quality of experience. The sharp, crystalline pain in the nose on the first breath. Outside the way, exposed skin registered damage within 30 seconds. The character of the air that made it feel less like something being breathed than something that was doing the breathing for you, extracting heat from the interior with every cycle. In the town, Greer had begun rationing. Sugar first, then coffee items whose absence was an inconvenience rather than a threat. Then flour, then salt, which was no longer an inconvenience. The prices on what remained had tripled in a week, the math of scarcity working with the clean indifference of all mathematics. The community was discovering that the social contract which had held through moderate winters was under a pressure it had not been engineered to withstand. Families who had shared meals in October were calculating in January exactly how many meals their own stores would support, finding the number smaller than they had believed. Greer went to the storage room behind his store on the morning of the 10th, a space built into the back wall above ground, accessed through a heavy door he had always considered adequate. He had put by considerably more than most because he was the commercial backbone of Coldwater Flats, and the backbone did not run short. He moved to the third barrel from the left, the one containing a reserve of winter wheat flour, opened the lid. The smell reached him before the sight did, a sourness organic with something underneath it that was darker. He tilted the barrel toward the light from the small window. The flour on the surface had a dark center, a spreading darkness that moved down through the layers in the specific pattern of moisture, working through a stored medium from a single point of entry. The barrel's wooden stave on the right side had a hairline crack he had not noticed in October, the kind that opens imperceptibly as temperature cycles the wood, the kind of gap that invites moisture without advertising its presence. 60 pounds of flour, transformed by water time and the warmth of a building that was better insulated than open air, but not perfectly controlled, transformed into 60 pounds of evidence that provision and storage were not the same discipline, and that he had spent 20 years mastering the first, while assuming the second required no mastery at all. He stood in the back room looking at the barrel for a long time. Around him, the boards of the building contracted in the cold with small sounds like deliberate punctuation. He had read a journal that contained the answer to this problem, held it in his hands for 3 minutes, and understood nothing. The 12th of January arrived with the peculiar mercy that the worst days sometimes extend a morning that was almost mild. The overnight low had been 10 below, and by mid-morning the temperature had climbed towards something approaching zero, which at this point in the winter felt like moderation. The sky held a clear, pale blue. No wind. Children who had been kept inside for 2 weeks were permitted out. Men checked on livestock they had been managing through the walls. The old-timers called it a breather, the name long experience had given to these deceptive intervals, and they said it with a wariness the younger settlers did not share. Willa was at the creek breaking ice to draw water when the quality of the light changed. She did not notice it through her eyes first. She noticed it through something less specific, a change in pressure or in the character of the air itself, as though something large had drawn a breath nearby. She straightened and looked at the sky to the northwest. It was the color she recognized from a page near the middle of her father's journal. He had sketched it in pencil, a horizon study, the specific greenish yellow that precedes the worst kind of pressure system, the color of a sky doing something structural rather than decorative. Beside the sketch in his careful handwriting, this color means stop what you are doing. Get inside. Close everything. Do not go out again until it is over. She picked up her water bucket. She did not run running on ice in hard-soled boots, was a specific kind of bad decision. She moved as quickly as the ground allowed. At the cabin, she built the fire up substantially, not a modest addition, but a real one, stoking it to a heat that would hold for hours without attention. She brought more wood inside, stacking it against the interior wall where it would stay dry. She maneuvered the cow back inside the animal, moving with a docile cooperation, suggesting its own instincts were in agreement with the project. She stuffed the remaining gaps in the window frame with rags. She pulled the interior door tight, dropped the wooden brace into the brackets. The light outside changed again from the greenish yellow to a gray so complete it looked as though the sky had simply removed itself from the equation. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in less than an hour. She tracked it not by thermometer, but by what she could hear through the walls, the sounds the prairie makes when it is transitioning from one state to another. Rapidly, sounds that don't have names because there are too few of them to require names. Then the wind arrived. Not gusted in. Arrived full force all at once, as though it had been somewhere else at full force for some time and had simply now reached Coldwater Flats. Carrying snow so fine it passed through the air rather than falling through it, turning the world outside the frosted window into a uniform white that was indistinguishable from no world at all. 3 miles north of the cabin in the house he had built 8 years ago, from boards hauled out of Millhaven on a wagon, Carl Bauer was watching the same transformation from a different position. Carl was not a careless man. He had been in Dakota Territory 8 winters. He understood what a season could do. His house was solid, the chinking good, the foundation properly banked with sod. The thing he had not accounted for, the single variable that undid everything else, was the woodpile. He had put by what he calculated to be sufficient. It was for a winter of the kind he knew. The winter of 1887 was not the kind he knew. By the second morning of the blizzard, his calculation had been invalidated by the rate at which the cold was consuming his stored heat, a rate significantly higher than his experience had suggested he prepare for. The barrel stove ran through wood at a pace that alarmed him. On the second afternoon, he made an assessment. The woodpile was outside, not 50 yards from the door. He had made it there before in bad conditions, not in conditions exactly like this, but in conditions that had felt serious at the time. He was a large man, physically capable, not prone to overestimating his own abilities. The 50 yards was not a distance that should be impassable. He had been a man who trusted his own body for 8 years on this land, and his body had not failed him yet. He tied one end of a rope to the interior doorknob. He coiled the rest across his left arm, told Martha to hold the other end, as a guideline told her it would take him 4 minutes. He pulled his coat to his chin. Martha was 31, with the particular composure that long exposure to difficult things produces in a person who has decided not to be destroyed by them. She took her end of the rope without speaking. She held it the way you hold something you intend to keep holding. The door opened. The blizzard entered the room. For the 3 seconds the door was open, a white roaring that erased everything in it. Then the door closed. She stood alone in the room with the rope running from her hands through the gap at the bottom of the door out into the white. The rope went taut. She felt him moving through the tension of it, the specific quality of a line carrying a person's weight against resistance. Then it went slack, not the slack of return, not the loosening of a line paid out deliberately, but the wrong kind, the kind that means the connection has been severed somewhere in the middle. She held the rope anyway. She held it for a long time until the act of holding something that was offering no feedback became a specific kind of unbearable. And then she held it longer than that. The rope that came back through the door when she eventually opened it was just rope. The knot at the doorknob end was intact. The other end had pulled free from his grip, or his grip had released from his hand sometime in the white chaos of the 50 yards. She did not know exactly when. The blizzard was not interested in explaining. When it ended 2 days later in the stillness that follows the collapse of something enormous, Martha Bauer walked out into a world that was white and blue and entirely quiet. She found her husband 10 feet from the woodpile. His right arm was extended toward it, reaching still the gesture preserved. His eyes were closed, which was perhaps the only merciful detail in the entire picture. She sat down in the snow beside him. She did not call his name. He was gone many hours past the point where calling would change anything. She sat there until Reverend Hatch arrived on snowshoes through the drifts, having spent the previous hour moving down the road and checking each property one by one. He said nothing immediately when he found her. He put his hand on her shoulder. She let him help her to her feet. She did not look back at Carl when they walked toward the house, not because she couldn't bear to, but because she had already seen everything there was to see, and nothing more that looking would add. The blizzard had cost Coldwater Flats more than Carl Bauer, though Carl Bauer was the cost that could not be recovered. The livery roof collapsed under the snow load, taking 3 horses with it. 2 families who had banked their foundations with hay rather than sod discovered the difference between materials when the wind found that difference before they did, spending the worst hours of the storm burning furniture rather than wood. Greer's store became the provisional center of a community, discovering that the provisions at its center were less adequate than their presence had implied. The rationing that had been discreet in December became explicit and contested in January, the store's inventory now fully visible in its inadequacy. Inside the cabin, through 3 days of white roar that Willa experienced as a sustained siege, her system operated without incident. The sod banking held the wind from the north wall entirely. The deep snow building up against the cabin's exterior acted as an additional insulator, a fortuitous effect she had noted as a theoretical possibility in her father's journal, but had not been certain of until she experienced it from the inside. The interior temperature, far from dropping during the worst days, actually stabilized slightly the cold outside, so extreme that the temperature differential between interior and exterior paradoxically slowed the rate of heat loss through the walls. Each morning she lifted the loose board, lowered the thermometer into the dark below. 41, 40, 42. The variations were small within the range of measurement error. The earth below the frost line was registering the blizzard the same way it registered everything else that happened above ground, which was to say it was not registering it at all. She ground grain by hand on the morning she could hear the storm at its worst, the rhythmic sound of the cast iron mill providing a counterpoint to the wind's noise. She cooked small portions on the stove, ate slowly, gave a measure of the cooked grain to the cow, who accepted it with bovine equanimity. She read by lamplight on the afternoons. The outside light was reduced to nothing by the wall of white at the window. She slept as much as her body required, which was more than usual, a sensible response to the body's sustained need to conserve heat. On the night that Greer's thermometer, the most accurate in Coldwater Flats, reached its absolute floor, 40 below, a number the instrument's maker had apparently not anticipated needing to represent Willa, was on her cot with the quilt over everything, her breathing slow. She was not afraid. She was warm enough by her particular definition of warm enough. She was fed. The thermometer below her floor read 41 degrees and would continue to read something near 41 degrees regardless of what the thermometer on the outside of Greer's store did, because they were measuring 2 different things: the surface world with its violent fluctuations, the underworld with its absolute unassuming constancy. She thought about her father as she fell asleep. Not the sick man in the Cleveland house, though she had loved that man without reservation. The other one, the man who had stood on the deck of an ore ship in November on Lake Erie, with water coming over the bow, a manifest in his hand, knowing exactly what was in the hold below him, knowing it would be there when the weather broke. A man who understood that what you have prepared for is always more important than what is happening to you in this exact moment. He had spent his life learning the difference between those 2 things. He had given the distinction to her. It was the only inheritance that mattered because it was the one that could not be taken. The storm broke on the 3rd day. The silence that came after had substance, not the absence of sound, but the presence of quiet as a thing in itself. The sky cleared to a blue so sharp it seemed recently manufactured. She rose. She ground a measure of grain. She cooked and ate and lifted the board and checked the thermometer 41 degrees, then replaced it with the same care she brought to everything that mattered. She washed her hands in the small amount of water she had stored, dried them, stood in the middle of the quiet room. Outside, the county road had disappeared under drifts of a scale she had not seen before. The broken fence line was gone. The shed existed as a shape rather than a structure. The world had been simplified by the blizzard into a landscape of pure white forms, the details of everything below 3 feet erased. She was thinking about what came next, about the families, the community, the knowledge that had kept her alive through the worst winter in this territory's recorded experience. She was thinking about what to do with it. Then something, a sound that was not the settling of the cabin, not the cow, not the wind which had gone entirely. A sound at the door, a knock faint, with the quality of something that has been repeated more than once before producing a result. The knock of a person who is not certain anyone is there, but is knocking anyway because there is nowhere else to go. She crossed to the door in 4 steps, lifted the brace, pulled it open. Thomas Pratt stood at the threshold with the look of a man who has spent the last mile convincing himself that arriving was a reasonable thing to do. His face had been windburned down to something raw, the skin across his cheekbones pulled tight in a way that suggested the cold had been doing its work on him at a cellular level. His beard carried actual ice in it, not frost, but solid chunks formed, where his breath condensed against the hairs. Behind him, Margaret held Ben against her side with one arm, the boy's face pressed into her coat. Ada was tucked against Margaret's other hip, small enough that she was nearly invisible inside the layering of blankets wound around her. They had walked a mile through drifts that in places came to Thomas's waist. This was visible in the state of all of them, the specific exhaustion that is not ordinary tiredness, but the particular depletion of a body that has been working at its thermal maximum for an extended period. Willa stepped back from the door without speaking. They came inside. She closed the door, dropped the brace. The sound of the wind outside, not fierce now, but present, the kind the Dakota Plains maintained as a baseline, reduced to a low register the cabin walls absorbed into their mass. She moved to the stove, added wood, adjusted the draft. Let the fire respond. Then she turned to them. They were standing in the center of the room with the collective posture of people who have arrived somewhere but cannot quite believe the arriving is over. Margaret was unwinding the outer blanket from Ada with fingers that were not fully cooperating. Willa crossed to her, took the blanket's edge, worked it free with the practiced efficiency of hands that had spent a winter being useful. Ada's face when it emerged was pale in the specific way that means the body has been prioritizing its warmth budget, carefully pulling blood from the surface to protect the core. She looked at Willa with the wide, unfocused gaze of a child whose body has been very frightened for a while, whether or not the child herself was old enough to understand why. Willa took the small hands between her own, rubbed them in slow, firm circles, not too fast, because rapid rewarming of cold-damaged tissue caused damage of its own, a detail from the journal she had cataloged months ago without knowing when she would need it. She moved to Ben next, checked his ears. His fingers confirmed what she suspected, cold through, but not damaged. She put water on the stove. Not for tea, just water warm enough to drink because warmth from the inside was the first requirement before food, before anything else. She handed the first cup to Margaret, who drank it with both hands wrapped around the tin, her shoulders releasing something they had been holding for hours. While the porridge cooked a portion larger than her daily ration, no hesitation over this, she chafed Thomas's hands, which had taken the worst of the cold, because he had used them throughout the walk to break the passage through drifts for his family to follow. He sat on the cot with the expression of a man who has arrived somewhere real after a long time in unreality. The porridge was thick, made from the oat stores in the pit, enriched with a small amount of rendered fat. She ladled it into 4 bowls, set them on the table. The family moved to it with the silent coordination of people who have passed beyond ordinary social ceremony. Ben finished first with the speed of a young body that had been waiting for this longer than it knew how to articulate. Margaret ate more slowly, pausing between spoonfuls in a way that suggested she was monitoring her children's intake alongside her own. Thomas ate with his head slightly down in the manner of a proud man doing the necessary thing without being comfortable about any of it. Ada finished her bowl. She looked up from it, thin face eyes still adjusting to warmth at Willa at the pot on the stove. Her voice was barely separate from the room's quiet. Is there more? Willa looked at her for a moment. 4 years old, 10 feet of blown snow between this cabin and anything resembling alternative shelter. The barrels below the floor represented a calculation she had run many times. The number at the bottom of the calculation had room in it. Yes, Willa told her. There is more. She filled the bowl. Ada ate the second portion with the same focused gravity she had brought to the first. Willa watched the child eat, ran the arithmetic in the way that had become automatic weeks remaining. Mouth's daily measure, arriving at a result that was not abundant, but was sufficient. There was a difference between those two things. She had learned to live in the difference. The five of them spent the night in the cabin with the cow. The arrangement was not comfortable. Comfort was not the present standard. Thomas slept on the floor. Margaret took the cot with the children Willa beside them. 5 bodies in an enclosed space produced measurably more heat than one. She noticed this with the part of her mind that was always accounting. In the morning clear sky, the blizzard dissolved entirely into the silence it always left behind. Willa made a decision she had been approaching for weeks. She had built the system in secret, buried it under the floor, told no one its nature. The secrecy had been strategic. A buried resource is a protected resource, particularly in a community where the primary power had demonstrated both the capacity to make people desperate and the infrastructure to do it efficiently. But the secret had served its purpose. A resource used by one person operates at its minimum value. The knowledge her father had given her was not proprietary. It had come from him who had received it from the accumulated practice of men who had provisioned lake vessels for generations, who had received it from men before them. It had passed through her. Holding it past the moment it could save lives was not prudence. It was waste. She stood at the stove with the wooden spoon in her hand, the morning porridge cooking. She thought about the rope attached to the door handle, the wrong kind of slack coming back through the gap. She thought about Martha Bauer sitting beside her husband in the snow, not calling his name because he was past hearing it. She turned. Thomas was at the table, watching her with the alertness of a man who has been rescued and is trying to understand his obligations. Her voice was direct. Before you go home, I want to show you something. She moved to the third board from the west wall, bent, lifted it. The cool air rose. She held the lantern over the opening, let the light drop into the stone-lined chamber below. Thomas came and stood beside her. He was quiet for a long time. Not the silence of incomprehension, but the silence of a man resorting a large number of things he thought he understood. Then, you've had this all winter. Since October. She set the lantern on the floor, sat cross-legged at the edge. I'm going to explain how it was built. Not just the steps, the reason behind them. A reason you can adapt when circumstances change. A method without its reason breaks the first time something goes differently than planned. She told him about the frost line, about stable temperature below it regardless of what the surface world chose to do. About moisture, her father's named enemy, the partner of air in destroying stored grain from the inside out. About the specific compound of beeswax and fat that denied both moisture and air any access through the barrel staves. About the depth requirement, the stone lining the critical importance of the dry straw layer. Thomas listened the way people listen when they are hearing something that would have changed the past if they had known it sooner. When she finished, he was quiet again. Then my grandfather in western Pennsylvania, he did something like this under the smokehouse floor. Stone line sealed with salt and fat. I thought that was something old men did that didn't apply anymore. He stopped. The recognition on his face was the specific kind that comes when you understand you had the answer and didn't know it was an answer. Willa let it sit. Physics doesn't become outdated. What works in Pennsylvania works in Dakota. She gave him a written copy she had prepared the previous evening while the family slept, the key principles, measurements, the compound recipe, the temperature tables from her father's pages. Not the original journal. The copy had everything necessary. He took it with the careful hands of a man receiving something that matters. She told him to add to it whatever he learned. Give copies to his neighbors. Treat the knowledge the way knowledge survives, by moving it forward with the expectation that it will be improved by the people it reaches. He rode home that afternoon with his family. Willa watched them go from the doorway, the small figures diminishing into white until the landscape absorbed them. Margaret turned once and raised a hand. Willa raised hers in return. Lucy Haddon arrived 2 days later on foot in better condition than the Pratts had. She was alone, moved faster, had been managing her stores carefully since December. She had not run out. She had come because Thomas Pratt had returned to his farm with something more than food, had already described what he had learned to his nearest neighbor, who had described it to the next farm. The information moving with the urgency that useful knowledge moves when people understand that having it changes something. They sat at the table for 3 hours. Lucy asked different questions than Thomas had, more about moisture indicators, about recognizing a compromised seal, whether the principle extended to root vegetables or only grain. Willa answered what she knew, said explicitly where her knowledge ended and estimation began. The honesty was part of the lesson. A person who distinguished between knowledge and guesswork could be trusted with both. Lucy left with a written copy, a measured portion of oats, specific guidance on making the compound herself in spring. At the door she paused, voice quiet but certain. My children will grow up knowing this. Not a thank you, something larger. A statement of what she intended to do with what she had received. Martha Bauer came on a Tuesday morning, 1 week after Carl had been buried in ground too frozen for proper depth, the burial to be corrected when the earth released. She came alone. She walked the 1.5 miles from her farm with the deliberate pace of a person who has decided to do something and is not interested in being talked out of it before arriving. Willa saw her from the window while she was still on the county road, a figure moving through the white, alone, straight-backed. She knew who it was before Martha was close enough to be identified by face. She put water on the stove. Martha came in. She removed her coat, her scarf, her heavy gloves, set them on the hook by the door with an orderly precision that had nothing to do with social custom and everything to do with a woman who kept things in order, because the keeping of order was one of the ways she remained herself. She sat at the table. Willa set tea in front of her. They sat together without speaking. The silence between them was not empty. It held the thing that had happened, acknowledged without being named, given the space it required. Then Martha's voice came out clear with the quality of a sentence that had been prepared. Teach me. Not framed as a request, not softened. 2 words that contained her reason for coming, her intention, for what she received, the manner in which she had decided to carry what had happened to Carl. Willa opened the floorboard, held the lantern over the pit, explained everything she had explained to Thomas, to Lucy, to herself on 100 winter evenings, running the mathematics against her father's principles. Martha listened with absolute attention, a pencil in her hand, writing in a notebook she had brought in her coat pocket. Her handwriting was compressed, urgent, smaller than she intended, because she was writing faster than she was used to, trying to get it all down, to leave this cabin with nothing uncaptured. When Willa finished, Martha continued writing for another minute. Then she set the pencil down. Her voice was careful, each word measured. If Carl had known this in October, he would have built it. Not reproach, a fact delivered with the precision of a woman who dealt in facts, because facts were the only things that didn't change shape when examined from different angles. Willa looked at her across the table. Yes, he would have. Martha picked the pencil back up. Tell me the measurements again. I want the exact numbers. 9 more families came to the cabin in the 2 weeks following the blizzard. Some in genuine crisis. Others because they had heard what Thomas Pratt had learned, what Lucy Haddon was already telling her nearest neighbors, and they wanted the knowledge before the next winter rather than during it. Willa fed those who needed feeding. She taught all of them. She drew the same diagrams each time, explained the same principles, sent every family away with a written copy, because a principle remembered correctly is superior to a principle remembered approximately when lives depend on the remembering. It was during the 2nd week of these visits that the pattern became visible to her. 3 of the 9 families who had come in genuine crisis had parcels that Greer had expressed an interest in acquiring. 2 of them remembered specific conversations from the previous spring offers to purchase made casually and declined without obvious consequence. The consequence had been deferred. It arrived in October, when the credit extension that should have been routine was declined, when alternative arrangements had already become impossible to make. This was not a man benefiting from misfortune. It was misfortune being manufactured at a specific time for a specific result. The distance between those 2 things was the distance between ordinary greed and something more calculated. Willa sat with the understanding for an evening, examined it from every angle, then wrote it in the back of her father's journal in the methodical, specific language he had modeled: dates, names, parcels, the sequence of events as each family had described it. Not accusation, record, the same discipline she would bring to anything worth knowing. In the third week of February, with the cold still holding, but the worst clearly past, Thomas Pratt brought his children back to the cabin. His roof had sustained damage in the blizzard, a section of the north slope had buckled under the snow weight and needed proper attention before it failed entirely. The repair required him to be on site for several days, and Margaret would be helping, and the cabin was safer for Ben and Ada than an open work site in February temperatures. They arrived early on a Monday morning, Ben carrying his own small bundle, Ada asleep against Thomas's shoulder. Willa had prepared for them the cow's corner, reorganized a pallet on the floor near the stove, a supply of the cooked grain they had come to know. Ben set his bundle down with the careful propriety of a 6-year-old, trying to take up as little space as possible. Edmund Greer came to her cabin at the end of February. She saw him approaching from the window a full 10 minutes before he arrived, a figure moving from the direction of town on foot, the dark coat recognizable from a distance, even with the gelding absent. The horse had died 6 weeks prior. He walked the 2 miles without the authority the animal had lent his previous visits, in the manner of a man doing something he had not planned on having to do. Ben Pratt was on the floor near the stove, drawing shapes in fallen ash, with a stick he had found in the woodpile, the particular occupation of a child who has adapted to constrained circumstances. He looked up at the approaching figure through the window. "Who's that?" She looked at the boy, at the approaching figure. She thought about the rope attached to a door handle, the wrong quality of slack returning through the gap. She thought about Martha Bauer's pencil moving fast across a notebook page, writing down everything that should have been known in October. She thought about Doyle's letters in her father's trunk, the account of the morning the credit was declined with the offer following immediately behind it, and the price that was not a price but a conclusion already reached. She thought about her father at the kitchen table in Cleveland, holding a tool he was sharpening, saying in the tone he used for things he considered settled, "The knowledge a man keeps only for himself is knowledge used at its lowest value." She crossed to the door, lifted the brace, pulled it open. Greer stood at the threshold in a coat that had been expensive in October. 3 months of a winter beyond the range of his system's design had worked on it, the way the winter worked on everything, taking the substance out, leaving form without content. He was thinner. The broad authority of his face had been replaced by something raw. He did not look at her directly. "My wife." He started the sentence, stopped, tried again from a different approach. "The children have been—" The sentence again lost its end. He did not need to finish. She moved to one side of the doorway. He came in. He sat at the table without being directed to it. She went to the stove, ladled porridge into a bowl, the same porridge she had given the Pratts, the same she had given Lucy, the same she had given all 9 families. The measure she gave him was the same measure she had given everyone else, calculated by need. She set it in front of him. He ate with the careful attention of a man reestablishing his relationship with ordinary experience. When he set the spoon down, his hands rested on the table. She was already at the shelf measuring grain into a cloth sack. While she worked, she spoke in the tone she had used with every person she had taught this winter, the tone her father had used at the kitchen table in Cleveland, the tone of someone with something precise to communicate. Below the frost line, the earth holds a stable temperature regardless of surface conditions. Seal your stores against moisture with wax compound, beeswax, and tallow in roughly equal measure applied hot in at least 3 coats. Depth in this territory needs to be 4 feet at minimum, preferably 5. She was not teaching him because she had forgiven him. Forgiveness was a separate transaction she was not currently performing. She was teaching him because the knowledge was applicable to him the same way it was applicable to Thomas Pratt, to Lucy Haddon, to Martha Bauer with her pencil moving fast across a page. The winter did not have a separate physics for people who deserved it. The frost line sat at the same depth beneath Greer's land as beneath hers. The wax compounds sealed oak staves regardless of who had filled them. The equality of the instruction was not charity, it was the result of taking the physics seriously. He stood when he was ready to stand. He picked up the sack of grain. His voice when it came was rougher than she had ever heard it. "Your father." He stopped. "The things in that journal." Another pause. "I did not understand what I was reading." She waited. "I am understanding it now," he said. He moved toward the door. At it, he stopped, reached inside his coat, removed a folded piece of paper, set it on the table without ceremony. Then he left. She crossed to the table, unfolded the paper, the original mortgage document, the balloon payment clause underlined in the clerical hand of the county clerk. Across the top in Edmund Greer's accountant's script, the handwriting of a man who lived by ledgers, 2 words and a date, discharged. February 1888. No court stamp, no notary. The words in his hand on the only existing copy. A unilateral declaration was not itself a legal instrument. The territory had processes for clear title that this document did not satisfy. But a man who had walked 2 miles on foot without leverage of any kind had surrendered the primary document establishing the debt. Whatever the legal technicalities required, this was the most complete concession available to Edmund Greer without involving a judge. She folded it twice, placed it inside the front cover of her father's journal. April came with the authority of something that had been the correct answer all along. The rail line cleared in the first week. The county commission sat in the second week in the courthouse at Millhaven, the room holding more people than it had been designed for the people carrying the particular seriousness of those who have survived something together. Outside the courthouse windows, the first real warmth of the year was working on the snow, not melting it dramatically, but undermining it the way patient forces work when they have time. Thomas Pratt spoke first. He opened the notebook, the copy in Willa's handwriting, his own additions visible in a different hand, in the margins alongside notes he had taken from neighbors who had learned the method and made their own observations through February and March. He read the passage about the frost line, read the temperature table, read her father's original observation about moisture, which he had transcribed word for word, because some things should not be paraphrased. Then he closed it. This is what Willa Crane knew before winter. This is what none of us knew. That difference is the reason my family is in this room. Lucy Haddon described the December afternoon, the written instructions, the way the knowledge had been given without condition or payment. She described the morning after the blizzard when she had checked her stores using the method she had learned and found them intact. She described this in the plain language of someone reporting a verifiable result, not a miracle. Reverend Samuel Hatch set his own small notebook on the table in front of the commissioners. He had recorded every labor exchange Willa had made in the community from October through December, each day's work, each party, each commodity received. He had done this not knowing it would matter here, but because he was a man who recorded things, who had noticed something worth noting. He had converted each exchange to cash value using Greer's own store price list as his reference, then totaled the columns. The sum exceeded the balloon payment by 11%. He set the notebook before the commissioners without editorial comment. The numbers were the argument. Greer's attorney opened his mouth. One of the commissioners raised a hand. Martha Bauer stood. The room became quiet in the way it becomes quiet when a person with moral authority rises, not imposed silence, but the recognition that what is about to be said deserves to be heard without interference. She stood straight. Her voice placed each word with deliberate care. My husband died because he did not know what Willa Crane knows. Every person in this room is alive because she taught them what he did not have the chance to learn. She deserves the land. 3 sentences. She sat. The commissioners returned after 20 minutes. The senior commissioner, a man who had been on this frontier since before the territory had proper courts, read his decision in the voice of someone delivering a conclusion that the evidence had made inevitable. Extraordinary contribution to the public welfare of the community of Coldwater Flats. Documented value of services exceeding the outstanding mortgage obligation. The deed to the 160 acres satisfied in full. Title recorded in the name of Willa Crane absolute without encumbrance. Greer's attorney did not speak again. At the back of the room, Greer sat with his coat across his knees looking at the floor. The original document was already in Willa's journal. There was nothing left to contest. She walked out of the courthouse into April sunlight, the specific warmth of a sun that has finally won the argument it has been making since January. She stood on the courthouse steps for a moment, not in triumph. Triumph was the wrong category. What had happened was the correct conclusion of a physical process that had been running since October. A system built on accurate understanding of the world had continued operating until it produced an accurate result. That was not triumph. That was completion. Edmund Greer was not the same man after the winter of 1887. This was visible to anyone in Coldwater Flats who had known him before, which was everyone. The change was not dramatic or externally imposed. No formal accounting was ever made of the selective credit withdrawals that had weakened specific households before the storm. The mechanism was too indirect, too woven into ordinary commerce, too deniable. What changed was something more fundamental, his relationship to his own certainty. A man who had operated for 20 years on the conviction that he understood the governing forces of his community had encountered a winter in which his understanding failed in ways that mattered, while a 23-year-old woman with no assets had understood correctly. The lesson was expensive. He did not repeat the behavior not from external constraint, but from the revision of the premise that had produced it. He extended credit the following winter without categories. He funded the reconstruction of the livery stable roof without being asked. He was not transformed into a generous man in the way that word usually indicates. He became a more careful one, which was what the situation had always required. One afternoon the following spring, he passed Willa on the main street of Coldwater Flats. He stopped. She stopped. A moment in which the previous winter occupied the space between them, too large to speak around, too specific to speak about in public. When his voice came, it had none of the smooth executive quality she had known from it before. Your father was a careful man to have taught you what he taught you. She took the measure of what was in his face. Not guilt exactly. Recognition, the specific kind that arrives when a person understands they have been operating from a flawed map and has finally seen the territory. He was, she said. He nodded, walked on. She stood on the street for a moment after he left, watching the ordinary commerce of a spring afternoon in Coldwater Flats, the wagons, the children, the doors of the store opening and closing, and thought about her father's maps. His were accurate. They were the kind drawn by a man who had taken his own measurements rather than copying someone else's. Jed Holcomb died in January of 1901, in his bed in his cabin along the creek, which was where he had always expected to die. The winter that year was ordinary cold, but manageable, the kind that Coldwater Flats had learned over the preceding 13 years to navigate with the underground storage systems that had moved from farm to farm, the way practical knowledge moves when the people sharing it understand they are not giving something away, but multiplying it. Willa found him in early March when the first slight warmth had entered the air. He was on his cot, fully dressed, with the peaceful expression of a man who had been ready and had not been kept waiting long. The cabin was in order. His traps were cleaned and hung. The fire had been banked carefully. She buried him on the high ground north of his cabin, where he had once pointed during a walk they had taken in the autumn of 1893, pointing without speaking, which she had interpreted as the gesture of a man indicating his intentions. She said words over him briefly, without excess, the form of tribute he would have found least objectionable. She wrote in the back of the journal, J. Holcomb, knew the earth better than anyone I have met, said what needed saying, nothing else. She was offered marriage twice in the years following the winter. The first came from Robert Pratt Thomas's younger brother in the spring of 1889, a decent man, respectful in the offer, gracious in the refusal. He had understood, she thought, even as he asked, that the answer would be no. He had asked anyway because he was the kind of man who believed in asking. The second arrived in July of 1912 in the form of a reporter from Chicago named Calloway, 26 years old, with a notebook and the ambitious energy of a young man who believed he was tracking a story that would make his career. He had heard about the winter of 1888 from a rancher in Fargo, who had heard it from someone in Millhaven, who had heard it from Thomas Pratt's eldest son, the account having acquired elements that were not accurate and lost details that were essential. He found Willa on a summer morning at 48 with the evidence of 30 years of serious physical labor in her hands, working on the fence line that she repaired the same way she repaired everything, by understanding what it was supposed to do before deciding how to fix it. He wanted the story. He wanted her name attached to a narrative of a lone young woman against the Dakota winter in an entrenched power structure, which was accurate, surviving through some quality of spirit her readers would find inspiring. He was not wrong that these elements were present. He was wrong about which element was essential. She sat across from him at the table and looked at this young man with his notebook. He had the posture of someone who had rehearsed his questions on the road north from Fargo, who had prepared himself for an elderly woman living with her memories of a dramatic past. He had not prepared himself for a person who was still at 48, primarily interested in the future. Her voice came out as something she had not planned to say, but recognized as true when she heard herself say it. If you put my name on the story, people read about a woman who survived a winter. If you put the method on it, people will use it. He looked at her for a long moment. Something rearranged itself in his face, the particular adjustment of a young man encountering an intelligence he had underestimated. He wrote the article. He published it in November under the title Cold Storage, a Dakota Method, and the byline H. Crane Cold Water Flats DT. The article described the frost line, the construction of the sealed underground chamber, the wax compound, the temperature differentials, the specific measurements for the territory's conditions. It was read by farmers in Minnesota, Iowa, Wisconsin, the Dakotas. It was reprinted in an agricultural bulletin the following year. Letters arrived at the Coldwater Flats post office through the spring of 1913, addressed to H. Crane from farmers and homesteaders across the northern states who had built the chambers and wanted to report their results. She read every letter. She replied to some, particularly those that contained new data about temperature variations in different soil types. She never tracked how far the method traveled. The movement was the point, not the destination. He asked before leaving whether he could write to her. She gave him the address. He wrote 3 letters over the following year, each finding its way across the diminishing distance between who he had been in July and who he was becoming. She read all 3. She did not reply to any of them, not from coldness, but from the settled sufficiency she had been living inside since the spring after the winter of 1887. She had found the dimensions of her own judgment. The life she had built on this land, the knowledge she had transmitted the winters, she had navigated with the method that worked. These constituted a completeness she had not needed to search for because it had arrived as the natural result of doing the right work correctly. What she had was not loneliness. It was its own category, which she did not have a name for because she had never needed one. The cabin grew over the years through a series of careful additions and repairs. A proper stone chimney replacing the leaning original, a second room framed out against the east wall. The root cellar deepened to a useful depth. A real barn built south of the house to replace the leaning shed. Each improvement was planned the same way she had planned the pit, with an understanding of the underlying requirements before selecting the approach. The north wall's sod embankment had long since been replaced by proper insulation, the techniques for which she had learned from the same instinct that had led her to the pit by reading, by asking, by understanding the physics first. She died in her sleep on a warm night in late April 1939, in the main room of the cabin that had accumulated 52 years of repairs, replacements, incremental reconstructions, until it bore only a structural relationship to the building she had entered as a 23-year-old in September 1887. The night was unusually warm for the season. She had opened the window before lying down, letting in the smell of thawing earth, the creek running after winter, the specific form that spring took in Dakota, which was the smell of capacity returning to a landscape that had been holding itself in reserve. She was 75. She had outlasted the blizzard by 51 years, the mortgage payment by the same measure, the consensus of Coldwater Flats by a greater margin still. The land went to the Pratt family as she had specified, the deed transferring to Thomas's son William, with a letter enclosed explaining the pit beneath the kitchen floor and the care it required. The journal stayed with the cabin. William Pratt read the transfer letter twice, folded it carefully, placed it in his own keeping. He told his son about the pit, and his son told his son, each generation passing the information forward, the way Willa had always said knowledge should travel, with the expectation that the people receiving it would add to it from their own experience. In the autumn of 1978, a great-grandson of Thomas Pratt named Henry, for reasons the family had never fully traced after a man known only as the father of someone, known only through stories, drove out to the old property on a Saturday morning to begin clearing the site for a new house. The cabin had not been lived in since the late 1950s. The year since then having done the predictable things to its structure, the east wall down the roof gone in sections, the interior filled with the accumulation of seasons given uncontested access. He had a friend with him, a pickup truck, a set of tools. They worked through the morning, pulling wallboards, moving the fallen roof sections, the work proceeding with the efficient sadness of demolishing something that had once been cared for. When they reached the floor, they found it in better condition than anything above it, protected by the roof's gradual collapse around, rather than onto it. Henry was working with a pry bar, lifting boards from the west end, when the bar's tip found resistance. Not a nail, something harder. The resonant contact of iron against stone. He cleared the debris from around it, 3 boards worth of floor. The wood soft at the edges, dusty with the particular dust of a space that had been sealed from the air for a long time. He lifted the boards. Flat stones beneath them, carefully fitted each one, placed with the deliberate exactness of someone who understood that the placement would need to hold for a very long time. He moved two aside. Below them was dark, not the darkness of ordinary undisturbed Earth, but the specific darkness of an enclosed protected space darkness that had been maintained rather than simply accumulated. He leaned over the opening, his eyes adjusting. Stone-lined walls ran straight down to a depth he couldn't immediately gauge. The air that rose against his face was cool, not cold, not warm. Clean, carrying a dryness distinct from the October air around him. It smelled of stone, faintly of straw. Something further underneath those surface smells, distant and organic, that was the ghost of grain stored long ago in the dark, below the frost line, preserved in conditions that had changed nothing about it that mattered. He pressed his palm flat against the wall. The stones were tightly fitted, mortared with a gray compound that had held for 91 years. He measured the opening by feel 10 feet long, approximately 4 feet wide, dropping roughly 5 feet to the floor. His friend came and stood beside him. They both looked into the dark. The silence between them had the quality of standing in front of something that doesn't need explaining, but rewards attention. Henry Pratt sat on the edge of the opening for a long time with the cool air rising against his face. He thought about the name he had been given, which his father had said came from an old family connection he'd never fully traced after a man he had never met. He thought about the things he had grown up knowing about food storage, about the importance of depth, about sealed vessels, and what moisture did to grain over time. Things that were simply in the family's operating knowledge, not attributed to anyone in particular. Simply known the way, things that were given to you before you could ask where they came from. He thought about the first winter his father had dug his own pit, following instructions passed down through 3 generations, and how his father had said it was the most sensible thing he had ever built. He sat until the shadows had moved a meaningful distance across the cleared site. Then he stood, brushed the dust from his knees, looked at his friend. "We're not filling this in," he told him. His friend looked at the hole, looked at the plans they had brought for the new house's foundation, looked back at the hole. "The foundation goes around it," Henry said. It was not a question. The new house went up around it. He had the opening fitted with a door of smooth plain pine on brass hinges, brass chosen because it would not rust, would not require maintenance, would be there in the same condition 100 years from now as it was today. The concrete foundation was poured in a configuration that left the old pit accessible beneath the kitchen floor, reachable through the pine door with its brass hinges exactly as it had always been reachable through the third board from the west wall. The house was finished in November. On the first morning of real cold, the still dry, unannounced kind that came from the north. Without warning, the kind that Jed Holcomb had once said smelled like the winter of '48. Henry lifted the pine door. The air rose against his face, cool, stable, measuring the same temperature it had measured in November of 1887, when Willa Crane had held a thermometer to the lantern light and understood that her father had been right. He stood there for a long time with his hand on the pine door and the cool air moving against his face, thinking about a woman he had never met, whose name he knew only through family stories that had become imprecise over 90 years, whose method he had used without knowing. It was a method because it had simply been knowledge, the kind of knowledge that stops having an author once it has been given away often enough. Some things built correctly on the right principles persisted past all reasonable expectation. The earth below the frost line kept no calendar. It held what it had always held. It remembered what the surface in its seasonal violence perpetually forgot. That was the covenant. It held.